Okay, so we're back again this morning looking at Luke chapter 5, this time at verses 27 through to 39, which Grace has just read for us. And do please do keep them open in front of you, even though I think most of them will be up on the screen as I speak about them. And our title this morning is What Makes Jesus Refreshingly Different? And I'm hoping that the reason for that title will become clear before we finish today. Now, so far in Luke, we've already started to see how Jesus' teaching and Jesus' ministry was causing division. It divided the people. Yes, there were many who flocked to Jesus and who were delighted in what he did. Some of them even left everything and followed him. But others were less keen. Remember the people in Nazareth who wanted to throw Jesus off a cliff. And then last week, we saw the outrage of the religious leaders whenever Jesus claimed that he had authority to forgive sins. So there was division. And we're going to see this division in people's opinion about Jesus. We're going to see that again in today's passage. Now, Luke McKinley has been the author that I found most helpful, and that's true again this morning as I prepared for today's message. And Luke McKinley, he writes that while some people instinctively understood how to respond to Jesus, others couldn't see why his coming is good news. And that is so, so true. So please do look out for that. Watch out for it this morning as we look at today's verses. And constantly ask yourself which of those groups you're in. Where do you fit? What would your response be? Whether you truly see Jesus coming as good news, or if you remain unmoved. So our heading for verses 27 to 32, the heading is 6 sinners and a great physician, or a great doctor. In verse 27, Jesus, he spots a tax collector sitting at his tax booth. Here he's called Levi, but elsewhere it's Matthew. He has both names. And this is the Matthew who became one of Jesus' 12 apostles and who has given us the gospel that bears his name, the Gospel of Matthew. But whenever we first meet him, he's a tax collector. Now, we don't know if they'd ever met before, but whenever Jesus calls Levi to follow him, he got up, says verse 28. He got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. Just like Peter, James, and John had done in the passage we looked at last week. Levi left a comfortable, wealthy life and became a disciple of Jesus. Now, to grasp the significance of this, we need to realize just how hated and how despised tax collectors were. Maybe you don't like the tax collector today, but even more so, that was the case back when these verses were written. Because tax collectors were normally Jews who worked for the Roman government, collecting taxes from their own people, their fellow Jews, to support the occupying regime. And therefore, they were seen as traitors to their own people. And also they were seen as thieves because often they overtaxed people, taking more than they should and kept the extra for themselves. So they were both traitors and thieves. And so they were the ultimate sinners. Enemies of God and enemies of God's people. Now, most would have expected that when the Messiah came, he would oppose them and even punish them, not welcome them as friends and followers. So think of the utter shock it would have caused whenever Jesus called Levi, this tax collector, to be one of his followers. No one with any decency would associate with such a person. That's what most people thought. But then Jesus didn't worry about what people thought. He didn't worry what people thought of who he is or what he does. In fact, when Levi holds a banquet in Jesus' honor, Jesus seems to have no problem whatsoever in being part of that banquet. even though many who were there were tax collectors. Jesus went along and he even ate with them. And eating with them was a sign of his willingness to share in fellowship, to share in community with them, rather than shun them. Now, for the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders watching this, it was just more than they could stand. And so they erupt with frustration, they erupt with anger. Verse 30, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law complained to Jesus' disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, if we have read much of the New Testament, we can be very quick to label the Pharisees as the bad guys in every story, and often they were. But we mustn't miss the dynamics of what's going on during encounters like this one. You see, the Pharisees actually believed that they were the good guys. They were the ones concerned about keeping the rules. They were the ones concerned about behaving in the way that good people ought to behave. So they actually believed they were the good guys. So just imagine, to help us put that into our perspective today, just imagine how we might feel if Jesus turned up here this morning and started criticizing churchgoers and then headed off to a party full of drug dealers and prostitutes. We might feel just as outraged as those Pharisees did. But then Jesus explains his actions in verses 31 and 32. These are well-known verses and they're wonderful. Jesus answered them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now that's a powerful image, a really powerful image. You see, you and I, we know that we go to the doctor whenever we're unwell. Yes, sometimes we might go for a checkup or whatever, but generally, most of the time when we go to the doctor when we know we're sick, when we realize we need the doctor's help. Now, spiritually speaking, that's the sort of people that Jesus calls, the kind who know that they need his help and who are willing to leave behind all that's sinful and turn to him and follow him. That's the sort of person who ends up as Jesus' friend. Those who realize that they're hopelessly sick with sin and who run desperately to Jesus for help and for forgiveness. But those who don't see their need for Jesus, well, they're like the Pharisees in this story today. So ask yourself, which one are you? Are you a Pharisee, or are you a sinner and you know your need for Jesus? You know you need him to heal your sin-sick heart, and so you've run to him. Jesus came to call sinners to repentance, not those who wrongly think that they are righteous already and who therefore see no need of Jesus and the forgiveness he offers. Truth is, the Pharisees were not righteous. Later in Luke's Gospel, Jesus points out their hypocrisy. He points out their greed, and he calls their deeds evil. But because they think that they're righteous already, they have deceived themselves into thinking that they've no need for Jesus. And so they've no interest in the help and the healing that Jesus can give, healing from sin. So the message of this first little part, in essence, it is, don't be a Pharisee. Please don't be a Pharisee. Be like those who see their need of the doctor. Next then, in verse 33, Luke's account tells us they, which means the people at the banquet, they said to Jesus, "John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking." It seems like a reasonable enough observation by these tax collectors. They're all at Levi's party, and they comment on the fasting and the ritual prayers that John the Baptist and the disciples of the Pharisees, they all fast and they all perform these ritual prayers. But they've noticed that Jesus' disciples, they eat and drink. In other words, Jesus' disciples didn't seem as religious or devout in their behavior. And the people at the banquet they're wondering why Jesus seems so unconcerned, why he doesn't urge strict religious practices on his followers too. After all, surely people would judge Jesus by the behavior of his disciples. But again, Jesus doesn't seem bothered. Verse 33, it's up on the screen there, verse 33 mentions fasting. Now that was often a sign of mourning either for sin or because of something sorrowful like the death of a loved one. But fasting could also be a sign of what Luke McKinley describes as a hopeful dissatisfaction with the present state of things. I'm going to say that again. That fasting could be a sign of a hopeful dissatisfaction with the present state of things. An example that he gives is Anna, the prophetess Anna, back in Luke chapter 2. You remember her? She fasted. She fasted while she looked forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. And then, of course, John the Baptist, his disciples fasted as they waited expectantly for the coming of the Messiah. So therefore, now that Jesus has arrived, now that he was with them, it made absolutely no sense for his disciples to be fasting. You don't fast at a wedding. Sure you don't. You go there for some nice food. You don't fast at a wedding. And that's what Jesus explains in verses 34 and 35. He uses this common Old Testament image in which God is described as the bridegroom of his people. So what Jesus is saying is that, so long as he, the bridegroom, is with them, his disciples should celebrate. They should celebrate, not mourn, because they're the friends of the bridegroom. You don't fast at a wedding. But then later, whenever Jesus is taken from them, says verse 35, and he's referring now to his crucifixion and then to his ascension thereafter. Whenever Jesus is taken from them, that will be the time for fasting. Because at that time, Jesus' disciples will be again waiting expectantly, but this time for his second coming. You see, Jesus' first coming was an absolute game changer. It turned everything upside down. Now, to explain just how different, how changed things are because of Jesus, he tells them a parable in verse 36. He says, "No one cuts a piece out of a new shirt to mend an old one. They just won't match. And the new shirt would be destroyed too. You end up with two shirts that you can't wear instead of one." And then, of course, Jesus is making the same point in verses 37 and 38 when he talks about the wineskins. He says he's talking about new wineskins, and new wineskins were quite stretchy, and they could cope with the fermentation of new wine without bursting. But old wineskins couldn't, and they could only be used for old wine. So the shirts and the wineskins both make the same point, and it's about Jesus and about how everything changes with his arrival. The old shirt, the old wineskins represent Judaism, whilst the new shirt and the new wineskins represent Jesus and his ministry and, well, the followers that come after. I want to quote from Mike McKinley. It's a slightly longer quotation, but it's very helpful. He writes this: "Jesus hasn't come to patch up the things that were missing in Jewish religion, even the religion of the most pious people like the Pharisees. The point that Jesus is making is that his arrival has brought something new, a new covenant, and a new reason to celebrate like guests at a wedding. The salvation that Jesus has come to bring demands fresh thinking about what it means to live as God's people. I think that's so helpful. And what it explains is wonderful. But sadly, many people like the old wine that they're familiar with, and so they're just not interested in the new wine. They like the beliefs that they've grown up with and which they've followed for years, and so they reject Jesus, just like the Pharisees had done. So many people do that. They're like the Pharisees who think that what they have is enough. And they believe that they don't need Jesus, that what they have is enough already. This, I believe, is what Jesus is lamenting in verse 39 when he says, "No one after drinking old wine wants the new, for he says the old is good." It's as if Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you've been drinking that old wine of Judaism so long that you absolutely have no interest in the good news that I bring. And the question we have to ask ourselves is might Jesus be saying the same to you today? Examine your own heart and ask yourself, do I love my old religious beliefs that I grew up with? Perhaps that's moralism or whatever. Do I love my old religious beliefs so much that I have no interest in the gospel of Jesus? That sounds ludicrous that anyone would think that way, but sadly, it can so often be the case. And it's what makes reaching church-going people so difficult. Many are satisfied with their beliefs, but those beliefs don't include Jesus, or at least not the Jesus that we meet in the Bible, or the radical changes that he brings. In many ways, godless, atheist people can be easier to reach with the gospel because they realize more quickly that they're sinners, they're sick and need a doctor. And so they can be easier to reach. People like Levi, this tax collector. So the message is don't miss the party. Okay, don't miss the party. That's Mike McKinley's final heading for this morning. Remember those religious people who were scandalized that Jesus attended a banquet full of sinful tax collectors. If Jesus was a religious teacher, then they expected him to be somber and serious. But no, Jesus described his coming, and he described the good news that he brings as a reason for rejoicing, a reason to celebrate. Now, only people who can see their sin and therefore their need of Jesus, only they will be glad at the salvation Jesus brings. And I hope that describes you. I hope that describes every one of us gathered here this morning. Because for those who are content as they are, for them this new wine is no reason for celebration. And I think that's tragic. That's utterly tragic. So don't miss the party. Don't miss out on Jesus. Don't miss out on the forgiveness and the new life that he offers. Celebrate him. And give thanks that he has come as a doctor to heal and to save those who know that their hearts are sick with sin. Truth is, his sacrificial death and his victorious resurrection are the only cure for our sin-sick hearts. If you feel the crushing weight of your sin, that crushing weight of sin which you know will drag you to hell, then you know what you need. You know what you need to do. Run to Jesus. Run to Jesus and follow him. And if you're a follower of Jesus already, Please don't settle for how holy you are at the moment. And don't ever become conceited or proud that, well, don't ever think that you're better than those around you. I don't think any of you would ever do that, but please make sure you don't, as if we're better than the sinful people who have not yet acknowledged Jesus. No, if we're growing as Christians, if we're growing in holiness as we become more like Jesus, then we're going to become more and more aware of just how sinful we are. And of course, that leaves no room for pride, but keeps us humbly depending upon Jesus each and every day. So to quote Mike McKinley again, as we see God's perfect standard more clearly, we see our own sin more clearly. Again and again, that ought to cause us to be amazed by and to be thankful for the grace of God. The grace of God towards sin-sick people like us. And that gratitude brings a humility which prevents us from ever feeling superior to others, even the most sinful of people. Remember verse 31. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Jesus can save from sin. But the question is whether we realize our need of him, whether we see our sin and our need of him, and whether we're willing to ask Jesus to heal us and to set us free.